I'm Dorothy, 69 years old, and I built a 20 million yen house for my son, but on moving day they said, just move out, and left. I sold the house that same day. By the time they realized what I had done, it was too late. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about standing up to family manipulation. Trust me, what happened next will show you exactly how betrayal can turn into justice. I spent my entire working life at Company A for 41 years straight, never missed a month of rent, never asked anyone for help, and never let myself fall into debt. And after retiring, I thought I could finally live out the rest of my life peacefully with the only family I had left, which was my son and his wife. But that belief was shattered in less than 1 minute. I stood outside the new house I paid for entirely on my own, watching the moving truck I had rented and paid for with my pension funds pull into the driveway exactly at 9 a.m., just as scheduled, while my son and his wife pulled up in their car and stepped out without looking me in the eye. I greeted them like I always did, with warmth, with effort, with the hope that maybe everything would finally settle down after the long year of construction, paperwork, upgrades, delays, and compromises. But they looked at me like I was in the way, and that's when I knew something was wrong. The truck driver asked where to unload the boxes, and I was about to answer when my son interrupted and told him to wait because we need to talk first, which made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt since my husband passed away 17 years ago. He said they had a discussion the night before and had come to a decision, and I didn't even get a chance to ask what it was because his wife Mira stepped forward and said, without blinking, "We think it's better if we live separately." They looked me in the face and told me that I was no longer welcome in the house I had fully paid for, after a full year of them requesting upgrades, personalizing every room, controlling every design decision, and asking me for funds they said were urgent and necessary for our shared life. They waited until moving day, after I had transferred every last yen, after I had closed down my rental apartment, sold half my furniture, packed my life into boxes, and arranged my entire future around this house, just to tell me I wasn't part of the plan anymore. They used my money to build the life they wanted, and then tried to push me out the moment it was complete. They said things like, "We're from different generations," and "We don't want too many rules." And when I told them this house was my retirement plan and I had nowhere else to go, they said, "Well, maybe you can get another place near here." My own son stood next to his wife and nodded like he agreed with every word she said, like I hadn't raised him alone after his father died, like I hadn't worked 2 shifts during his high school years just to keep him in school. They didn't offer a solution, they didn't apologize, they didn't even try to explain why they chose that exact day to reveal their decision. They simply told me it was final, and that they would be moving in without me. They told me I could treat the money as a gift, and file the necessary paperwork with the local tax office, as if 20 million yen was something I had lying around for charity, as if their betrayal wasn't personal but administrative. I was never told that helping your child build a future meant you had to be erased from it. They acted like I should be grateful they were being honest now instead of later, but their honesty was nothing more than cruelty wrapped in timing. They had no remorse, no shame, and no backup plan for me, because they never planned to include me in the first place. They were willing to let me figure everything out on my own, even if that meant I ended up with nowhere to sleep that night, because the only thing they cared about was moving into the new house and pretending it had always been theirs. I realized then that I had been nothing more than a bank account to them, and now that the money was gone, they didn't even want to pretend anymore. My own son watched me struggle to understand what was happening and said nothing except, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." They waited until the very last moment to tell me because they knew that confronting me earlier might have put the house at risk, and they didn't want to take that chance until they had the keys, the truck, and the confidence that I wouldn't fight back. They miscalculated. They thought I would beg. They thought I would cry. They thought I would go away quietly. But what they forgot was this: I still held the deed. A full year earlier, my son and his wife sat across from me and insisted that it was time for us to build a home together, claiming that they wanted to support me in my old age, claiming that it was important to them that family stayed close, and saying they didn't want me to feel alone now that I was retired. I remember how they lowered their heads in unison and said it would make more sense to pool resources, how they painted a picture of shared meals, of mutual help, and of saving money by living under the same roof. And I agreed without hesitation because all I had ever wanted was to remain part of my son's life. They asked me to consider building a two-family house on a new lot, and even though I had been financially cautious my entire life, I told them I would do it, because I thought their request came from a place of love, not a scheme. They told me they didn't have enough saved for the down payment and that banks weren't offering them favorable loan terms, so I told them I would use the money from my pension, my retirement bonus, and the savings from the insurance my husband left behind after his passing. They promised they would handle the logistics, they promised they would make sure I was comfortable, and they told me that the plan was to make the house work for all three of us equally, so I handed over every yen they asked for and told myself I was investing in my future. Not once did they offer to contribute, not once did they ask what kind of space I would prefer, and not once did they ask me if I was okay with using the last of my savings, because they knew that I would say yes if I believed it was for them. I agreed to buy the land with my own name on the deed, and I funded every inspection, every survey, and every initial payment without question, because I believed that their sincerity was real and that their family values matched mine. They visited showrooms, chose materials, pushed for more features, and I signed off on everything they picked, even when it wasn't my taste, even when it cost extra, even when the upgrades had nothing to do with me, because I didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law who made things difficult. They asked me to wire large sums multiple times, each time saying it was the last adjustment, that the kitchen needed to be more functional, that the bathrooms needed to be upgraded for future value, and I believed them each time because I thought their intentions were good. Every time the builder came back with revised estimates, the number grew larger, but I continued making the payments because I had already committed and didn't want to jeopardize the relationship by questioning their judgment. They visited the construction site far more than I did, gave instructions directly to the foreman, made changes without telling me, and treated the house like it was theirs alone while referring to me in the third person as the one funding it. They convinced me that I didn't need much space, that I'd be better off on the ground floor, that my room should be small to make climbing stairs unnecessary, even though I never complained about stairs and still walked every day for over an hour. They designed a house where I had the smallest room, no direct access to shared living spaces, and limited storage, while they created an expansive second floor with multiple rooms, a walk-in closet, and a bathroom with custom features that cost more than my entire section. They used my name, my savings, my trust, and my love to build their dream, while pretending it was ours, and never once did they ask if I had any preferences for the materials, layout, or finishings in my own home. They made the builders install features I had never heard of, insisted on imported appliances, customized counters, ambient lighting setups, and other expensive items. And each time they assured me it was for long-term comfort, while reminding me subtly that I wouldn't need to use most of it anyway. They told the kitchen planner that I rarely cooked, which was a lie, and told the interior designer that my preferences leaned outdated, which I never voiced. And still I stayed silent because I didn't want to ruin what I thought was a rare chance at closeness. They built a house with my money but not with my presence in mind, and they did it with full confidence that I would never push back, because they believed that a parent's love was permanent and unconditional, no matter the abuse. The worst betrayal is when your own child weaponizes your kindness against you. They treated me like a silent investor, like a background character in their marriage, and they made every decision with the assumption that I would adjust, adapt, and disappear into the corners of a home I was paying for in full. They never offered to split costs, never told me how much the upgrades were costing in real time, and never once asked how I felt about burning through every last yen I had spent my life saving for emergencies and peace of mind. They acted like I was lucky to be included at all. My own son, who once cried in my arms when his father died, who once told me he'd never leave me alone, now stood beside his wife Mira as she directed the architects, made unilateral decisions, and requested additional features that she would use exclusively. It wasn't just about money, it was about power, control, and erasure. By the time we were 3/4 through the project, I had already transferred over 19 million yen and knew deep down that I was being sidelined, but I told myself that I was doing this for family, that all would be worth it once we moved in. But every quiet moment I brushed off became another opening they used to build a house that excluded me in everything but name. They wanted the benefits of my sacrifice, but not the burden of my presence. They treated my lifetime of work like an unlimited credit line. They exploited my desire for connection and twisted it into compliance. They convinced me this house was for all of us, but they were building it for themselves. And by the time the walls were up and the final invoice arrived, they no longer even pretended I mattered. The more the construction advanced, the clearer it became that every decision was filtered through Myra's preferences while my voice faded into something they treated like background noise. And even when I made suggestions about layout or asked to keep one traditional element that reminded me of my late husband, they either ignored me outright or dismissed it with a polite smile that felt like a final verdict. When I pointed out that the first floor room assigned to me was half the size of the guest room upstairs, they told me it was more convenient for my age, as if being 69 years old suddenly meant I had no right to dignity, comfort, or even symmetry in the house I had funded from beginning to end. They never asked if I liked the flooring, the wall panels, the appliances, or the layout of the kitchen they swore I wouldn't need because Mira had her own cooking style that didn't involve sharing space or routines. And even when I offered to take on housework or help with errands, they smiled like I was offering something burdensome. I was constantly told that I was being thought of, while every visible choice in that house told me otherwise. And even when the site supervisor asked me quietly if I was okay with the changes Mira kept making, I told him I trusted my son, because I didn't want to believe what I already knew. They gave me the smallest space, the least functionality, and absolutely no privacy from the entrance or common areas, while Myra's requests continued to stack up with zero hesitation and no regard for cost. And I kept saying yes because I still believed this was what family meant. They began referring to sections of the home as ours and yours in casual conversation, with theirs being spacious, air-conditioned, upgraded, and outfitted with the latest designs, while mine was treated like an accessory, something they tolerated because it came with the money. They joked that I would barely notice the features they added upstairs since I'd never really need to go up there. And even when I tried to raise concern over how much was being spent on Myra's preferences, I was met with deflections that positioned me as the one being unreasonable. They framed every cost as necessary, every upgrade as non-negotiable, every fixture as essential to modern living. And even when I asked if we could stay within budget, Mira would say something about quality of life and future resale value, and I'd be left with no way to challenge it without sounding like I didn't care about their future. They treated me like an investor who didn't understand the product. They manipulated every conversation to sound like they were doing me a favor. They made choices in my name while stripping me of every form of input or power. They pretended it was collaboration while systematically erasing every trace of me from the planning process. The total began to spiral, hundreds of thousands more for a specialized bath, another chunk for floor heating, upgraded lighting, a double vanity sink, soundproof walls, custom blinds, and each time the builder asked for confirmation, it was always me who wired the funds. I visited the bank so often that one of the tellers finally asked if I needed to speak to someone about financial safety, but I smiled and said no, because how could I admit to a stranger that my own son and daughter-in-law were bleeding me dry under the disguise of family? They never hesitated to ask for more. They never once checked if I was financially stable after each transfer. They never even said thank you after the third deposit. I was just a number, a silent faucet they thought would never run dry. Every part of that house was Myra's vision, Myra's comfort, Myra's future, while I became a shrinking presence confined to a corner unit that felt more like a caretaker's quarters than a home. They didn't just take my money, they rewrote my role in their lives without telling me. They made it clear that I wasn't being included, I was being tolerated. The final budget had gone 3 million yen over the original estimate, and they still had the audacity to tell me they were keeping things modest for my sake. When I tried to insist on choosing the wallpaper in my room, Mira laughed and said it clashed with the theme. And when I asked what the theme was, she told me it was young, open-concept living, as if that justified every inch of exclusion. I wasn't allowed to make a single decision about the main shared areas, and they never asked me to attend the final inspection or walkthrough, even though I was the legal owner on record. They made the house theirs while using my name to sign every form. They pushed me out of every conversation that mattered, then reminded me how lucky I was to be living with family. They wanted my money, not my presence. They wanted my support, not my opinion. They wanted my silence, not my voice. And I gave them everything because I still believed that family meant something. But their version of family had rules: silent elders, obedient benefactors, zero resistance. They reduced me to a source of funds while calling it inclusion. They removed my choices and called it care. They stripped away my agency and called it convenience. And I let them. Because every time I questioned it, I remembered what it felt like to be alone after my husband died, and I thought maybe, just maybe, this was the compromise I had to make to avoid going through that again. But compromises are only valid when all sides are honest. They weren't honest. They weren't fair. And they weren't family, not in the way they claimed to be. After the final round of payments had been wired and the construction company confirmed that the house would be completed within the next 3 weeks, Mira began sending me unsolicited lists of appliances and furnishings she expected to be purchased before move-in, each one labeled essential, and each total creeping higher than the last. She attached links to high-end refrigerators, imported dishwashers, specialized water filters, and designer lighting systems, all of which had price tags I would have never considered for myself. And yet I processed each purchase with minimal protest because I still hoped that keeping them comfortable would translate into long-term harmony. She demanded features that only served their lifestyle: double ovens for her weekend cooking, an oversized bathtub she said was necessary for mental wellness, and a voice-controlled lighting system for the second-floor living area. And each time I voiced hesitation, she'd forward me another blog post or influencer quote that justified the indulgence as modern necessity. My son, who once used to consult me about every job application and every minor decision, now acted like a silent bystander, saying little, defending nothing, and forwarding every cost-related conversation to Mira, who took on the role of project lead with full entitlement and zero respect. They presented me with a finalized layout in which my name was listed under Unit B, Main Floor, Limited Access, while their own names were boldly labeled Unit A, Primary Suite, Full Access. And when I asked if that meant I would be locked out of certain spaces, they said it was just for privacy, as if I were the one invading their boundaries. Every shared space, kitchen, living room, upstairs bath, dining area, was configured and furnished according to Myra's taste, and although I requested a small bookshelf and a desk in the common area to do my paperwork and reading, I was told there wasn't enough room, even as they ordered oversized seating and wall-mounted entertainment systems for themselves. They didn't allow me to choose a single appliance even though I was paying for all of them outright, and they didn't consult me about delivery dates, warranties, or specifications, only sending me the final receipts and expecting me to complete the wire transfers within hours of being notified. They told me to trust the process, even as that process excluded me from everything but the bill. They made me invisible in my own home while holding out their hands for more. They exercised full control without contributing a single yen. They treated my life savings like a bottomless budget for their convenience. Even the builder, who had tried to involve me early on, stopped calling me directly and instead sent updates to Mira, who then forwarded selective versions of those messages back to me when she needed additional funds to cover costs she had already approved. There were moments when I considered pulling the plug, when I looked at my bank account and saw the numbers drop far lower than I'd ever imagined possible in my retirement, but I kept telling myself it was too late to turn back, that confronting them now would cause a fracture that couldn't be repaired. I told myself that peace was more valuable than confrontation, that finishing the house would solve the tension, that living together would fix everything, even as every sign told me otherwise. The day the house was officially declared finished, Mira sent me a message stating that she had arranged for her parents to visit and view the property before we moved in, and I was told to stay out of the way to give them space, as if I were a tenant rather than the legal owner. She walked them through every room, called it our home, and described me to them as the mother-in-law downstairs, with a tone so casual and dismissive that even one of the builders later told me it felt uncomfortable to hear. They began referring to their section of the house as our sanctuary, and mine as the downstairs quarters. And I noticed Mira had even changed the labeling on the digital intercom system so that my room came up as B-Unit, guest, while theirs was labeled primary home. I asked them once if they planned to change the ownership registration once move-in was complete, and Mira responded with a printed tax form labeled gift declaration, where she had already filled in the total amount I had spent and drafted it as a donation to her husband, my son. She did not ask for permission before writing down my name and asset amount. She simply assumed I would sign. They assumed that once the house was complete, I would quietly fade out of the legal picture the way I had already been erased from the physical one. They counted on my silence to finalize their power. They weaponized politeness to drain my authority. They tried to bury me under paperwork and call it gratitude. The closer we got to move-in day, the more blatant their behavior became, and yet each time I brought up concerns about space, about costs, about legal clarity, I was treated as if I were threatening the peace of the family by refusing to be blindly agreeable. They made it clear that asking for fairness was disruptive. They punished every question with distance. They warned me subtly that raising issues would create unnecessary conflict, and my son echoed this by telling me to let things go for the sake of harmony, even as that harmony depended entirely on me disappearing from view and accepting whatever scraps of dignity they allowed me to keep. When I tried to establish clear expectations for living together, shared meals, housework balance, shared bills, Mira sent back a list of non-negotiables that read more like tenant restrictions than a family agreement. She explicitly stated that I was not to interfere in their routines, not to enter the shared kitchen without notice, not to expect joint meals, not to expect inclusion in their weekend plans, and that she preferred to handle cleaning on her own, which was code for don't touch anything. It was the final warning before the move. They told me without telling me that I wasn't family anymore. I was a relic they were tolerating for convenience, until the keys were in hand. They had already decided that my place was in the background. They planned a life around my generosity, not my presence. And they thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late. They were wrong. 1 week before the scheduled move-in, Mira sent a group message including me and my son where she outlined a new set of expectations for our co-living arrangement, but every line in that message was a rule meant to confine me, isolate me, or limit my presence in the house I had fully paid for without hesitation or protection. She emphasized again that I was not to interfere with meals, that I should keep my room door closed during their private time, that I should ask before entering shared spaces, and that my laundry and groceries should be handled independently, as if I were a stranger boarding in a space they owned rather than the legal homeowner. She stated outright that she wanted boundaries and emotional distance for the sake of marital peace, which translated into nothing more than an early notice that my presence was already being treated as an intrusion. She framed her rules as clarity, as maturity, as progressive family structure, while every word screamed that I was being removed from the equation the moment the paperwork allowed it, and that this entire past year had been nothing more than a financial transaction cloaked in false affection. My son responded with a thumbs-up emoji and said nothing else, which confirmed that his silence wasn't uncertainty. It was agreement, cowardice, and full alignment with a plan he had never warned me about. That silence hit harder than any insult. They had spent months using my resources to build a future they never intended to share, and now that everything was nearly finished, they were shifting from silent exclusion to formal rejection under the pretense of adult communication. They told me to respect their independence, when they had depended entirely on my money for the entire project. They lectured me on boundaries after violating every one of mine to get what they wanted. They acted like I was lucky to have a room at all. They rewrote the entire definition of family to suit their needs. 3 days before move-in, they posted online photos of the completed second floor with captions calling it "Our Dream Come True," tagging friends and relatives, accepting congratulations, and never once mentioning my involvement. Not even a passing "thank you" to acknowledge the sacrifice behind every wall, appliance, and fixture. That digital erasure confirmed the reality I had tried to deny. I was not a part of their future. They spoke publicly as if the house were entirely theirs, while still privately using my name on every bill, every deed, and every contact form. And the hypocrisy was so complete it became laughable. I kept the screenshots of their posts, their messages, and every receipt I had paid for my account. Because I no longer saw myself as part of their home, I saw myself as the only person holding evidence of what had truly taken place. 2 days before the move, Mira informed me via message that they would be arriving late and not to wait for them. And my son forwarded a list of deliveries scheduled under his name, even though none of them were paid for by him. They spoke in logistics while ignoring the human cost. They made plans while pretending I didn't exist. They treated my presence like an obstacle to their timeline. The night before move-in, I didn't sleep. I organized every document, every bank transfer record, every title copy, and called my lawyer to confirm once more that the property registration remained under my name alone, with no co-signers, no shared rights, and no legal transfer of ownership whatsoever. He confirmed again that I retained full legal control and that any attempt to evict me or seize control would be invalid without my signed consent, which I had never given. That confirmation solidified the truth I had begun to accept. They believed they had won already, but I still held the final move. They forgot that the person they were trying to erase was the only one who could legally erase them from the property. They believed control came from possession, but it came from the deed. They believed silence meant surrender, but it meant preparation. The next morning, I woke early, cleaned my hands, and made breakfast one final time out of habit, not hope. They arrived at the house just before the truck, Mira holding a clipboard and barking orders at the movers before even acknowledging my presence, and my son standing behind her, avoiding my eyes like a schoolboy caught cheating on an exam. They stood in front of the new home I had financed from my pension, my retirement bonus, and the life insurance left behind by a husband who always believed our son would grow up kind and grateful, and with the most casual tone imaginable, Mira said the words I never thought I'd hear. They wanted to live separately, and it would be best if I moved out. She said it with certainty, like it had been rehearsed. She said it without shame, like it was owed to her. She said it with entitlement, like she had earned the right to exclude me from the home I had made possible. They waited until the moving truck had arrived, until their things were ready to be placed inside, until the entire plan had been executed to perfection, before informing me that I no longer had a place in their version of the future. They had no intention of moving in together. They had used me to get the house, and now they wanted me gone. They told me they hoped I would understand, as if betrayal needed compassion. They told me it was for the best, as if deception deserved forgiveness. They told me I should respect their autonomy, as if erasing me was a right. They treated me like a problem they had solved the moment the walls went up and the appliances were installed, and they believed that framing it as a generational difference would soften the blow of what was clearly strategic theft. But the only difference between generations was that I believed in loyalty and they believed in leverage. They miscalculated my silence as submission. They believed my politeness meant I lacked options. They thought I would quietly disappear. But they had forgotten one simple fact. I never gave up ownership. The moment Mira said they had decided not to live with me, I didn't speak, I didn't protest, and I didn't argue, because I had already accepted that this was not a spontaneous change of heart, but a carefully timed execution of a plan they had nurtured for months behind my back while smiling in my face and calling it family. I watched them instruct the movers on where to place furniture and boxes, watched my son nod and gesture as if he were entitled to allocate space in a property that legally belonged to me, watched Mira walk through the entrance like she had inherited something rather than stolen it, and I realized that neither of them thought I was capable of pushing back. They had waited until the final moment to inform me because they believed that I had no alternative, no resources, no ability to resist, and because they assumed that age meant helplessness and that politeness meant weakness and that motherhood meant unconditional sacrifice, no matter the scale or severity of betrayal. They told me to return to the apartment I had already vacated, to the building I had already released the lease on, to a past I no longer occupied, and then suggested I consider the house payment as a gift for the sake of my son's financial future, as if my security and dignity were acceptable trade-offs for his convenience. They told me to file a gift tax form with the local authorities, already drafted and partially filled, implying that the transfer was an act of generosity on my part and not the result of systemic manipulation, gaslighting, and long-term financial abuse disguised as generational bonding. They spoke as if they had done nothing wrong, as if this was a rational conclusion to a mutual journey, as if their feelings mattered more than the facts, and they continued directing movers while pretending I wasn't standing right there with full legal control over every inch of land, wall, pipe, and tile they were trying to claim. They didn't ask me to leave, they told me to. They didn't offer a compromise, they issued a removal. They didn't express guilt, they expressed entitlement. They didn't betray me by accident, they engineered it. And they believed they could get away with it because I was standing quietly, absorbing it all, saying nothing, showing no emotion, just watching every detail unfold while storing every word, tone, and action for what I knew would come next. I let them talk, I let them move, I let them assign ownership of spaces, and I let them feel triumphant because nothing disrupts deceit more than proof. And I had it all: ownership, documentation, receipts, wire records, legal filings, and silence they mistook for surrender. The truck had already begun unloading, and the movers were carrying boxes toward the entrance as Mira pointed toward the second floor, completely unconcerned with my reaction, because in her mind, the deal had already closed, and I was just an obstacle she had outplayed. She didn't realize I had already made a phone call that morning to my lawyer to reconfirm title registration and ask what legal actions I could take in the event that unauthorized occupants attempted to take residence in a home under my name. He told me exactly what I needed to do, who to contact, what to say, which clause to cite, and which action would legally prevent any assumption of tenancy, and I memorized every detail before making one final call to a realtor specializing in fast liquidations of newly built residential properties. I informed the realtor that the house was legally in my name, fully paid, freshly completed, and available for immediate resale at a discounted price, and that if they could find a cash buyer willing to sign the same day, I would prioritize their offer over any others, and I told them I needed confirmation within hours, not days. I hung up, saved the details, and waited for the moment when they would finally cross the line, when Mira would declare the house hers and begin issuing instructions to the moving crew as if she were the legal homeowner, when my son would turn his back and say nothing while his wife took over a property that wasn't theirs to claim. That moment came as expected. Mira told the crew to assemble furniture in the main living room, connect appliances, and begin placing rugs and electronics while my son stood by without objection. And that's when I stepped forward and told the crew to stop immediately and asked who they were taking instructions from. They looked confused and turned toward Mira, who insisted the move proceed, and when they looked to me for confirmation, I calmly stated my full name and presented the property deed printed in triplicate, clearly indicating that I was the sole registered owner, with no co-owners, no transfer in process, and no legal occupants beyond myself. The lead mover hesitated, examined the document, and asked for clarification, at which point I explained that the individuals attempting to take possession of the home were not legally authorized to do so, had no tenancy agreement, no ownership rights, and no valid claim to residence. He immediately signaled his team to stop the unloading process while Mira protested in the background, and I walked a few feet away to make a second call to the realtor, who answered on the second ring and informed me that a buyer had confirmed interest and was willing to come that same afternoon with a full cash payment, no contingencies, and notarized documentation. I told them to prepare the contract, bring the paperwork, and meet me at the property with the buyer ready to sign. And then I returned to the driveway where Myra's voice was rising in confusion and anger as she tried to understand what had just happened and why her carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing in front of her. My son asked me to calm down, but I said nothing, walked past him, and informed the movers that they could leave the items on the truck or return them to sender, as the house would be sold before nightfall and there was no need to continue the charade of relocation. I stated clearly for everyone present that the house was being sold, that their belongings were not authorized to enter the premises, and that any attempt to do so would be met with legal consequences based on unauthorized entry, attempted occupancy, and misrepresentation of ownership. They stood in stunned silence as I pulled out my phone one final time, messaged my lawyer with confirmation, and began forwarding every document necessary to finalize the process of reclaiming the last shred of dignity and justice I still held in my hands. They had planned everything, except for me fighting back. After making the final call to confirm the cash buyer's arrival within the hour, I watched as my son and Mira stood frozen in disbelief, no longer giving orders to the movers, no longer walking around the house with the confidence of people who thought they had secured something permanent through deception, because they were finally realizing that the person they had underestimated most was the only person who had the authority to end everything they had manipulated into existence. Mira demanded explanations from the moving company, gestured toward the boxes as if their physical presence alone justified her right to occupy the space, and insisted she had a right to continue unloading. But the lead mover informed her that without ownership proof or signed authorization from the registered titleholder, they could not legally proceed with placement of any goods into the house. My son pulled me aside and asked what I was doing, but I did not respond because the time for explanations had passed, the time for begging had expired, and the time for trust had been permanently destroyed by a year of calculated decisions that led to this exact confrontation, one that had been building from the first moment they asked me to pay for something they claimed we would all share. They watched in stunned silence as I informed the realtor that I was ready to sign, that I had reviewed the buyer's terms, that the bank bag containing the full amount was confirmed, and that I would be transferring ownership by the end of the day with no room for further discussion, no emotional appeals, and no delayed deadlines. The realtor arrived 35 minutes later with a buyer who had come prepared with all documentation, financial proof, and legal representation, and they wasted no time in laying out the contract, verifying title status, and initiating the formal signing process that would ensure immediate transfer of the property to someone who had neither deceived me nor insulted me under the pretense of love. The moment I signed the contract, the buyer handed over the envelope containing the full purchase amount, and I counted each stack while standing directly in front of the people who had spent a full year pretending I didn't deserve even a seat at the table despite having financed the entire home from top to bottom. They stood pale and wordless as the realtor confirmed that all parties had completed the necessary documentation, that the registration transfer would be finalized within 24 hours, and that the movers should now redirect all belongings to a different address, because this property was no longer available for occupancy under any circumstance. My son stammered and asked if they could stay just one night, arguing that they had nowhere else to go, that the timing was too sudden, that the situation had escalated unfairly, but I reminded him through action alone that there is nothing sudden about betrayal that has been planned for months, and that there is nothing unfair about consequences earned through manipulation. Mira, now shaking, attempted to reframe everything as a misunderstanding, claiming that the conversation had been taken out of context, that they had simply been trying to protect boundaries, that the plan was always to live together in harmony. But I stared through her because there is no version of harmony that begins with exile. They tried to reverse engineer innocence after months of strategic exclusion. They tried to rebrand theft as miscommunication. They tried to pretend this was fixable after actively dismantling every bond that held us together. They pleaded for understanding after showing none. They asked for shelter after pushing me toward the street. They wanted mercy after delivering cruelty. They wanted grace after showing none. I gave them nothing, not because I lacked forgiveness, but because they had weaponized my love against me and assumed I would keep showing up with more. They had expected me to cave, to retreat, to cry, to apologize for resisting their theft. And when I did none of those things, when I signed away the house they thought they owned, they realized too late that the person they tried to erase had been the foundation beneath them the entire time. The movers asked for a forwarding address, and after several moments of hesitation, Mira whispered the address of her parents' apartment, and the lead mover gave instructions to load the items back into the truck, pausing only to confirm that no property was being left behind, as the new owner would take possession that same evening. I stood by and watched them pack every box they had attempted to place inside my home, watched them return each item that had been meant to symbolize permanence, watched them scramble to explain to the moving crew why the destination had suddenly changed from a custom home to a cramped apartment not prepared for their arrival. My son looked at me with a face I hadn't seen since he was a child, a face that knew he had crossed a line too far and too deliberately to ever be welcomed back with open arms. Because the betrayal was not accidental or emotional, it was financial, legal, and premeditated. They had treated me like an obstacle in the beginning, a resource in the middle, and an afterthought at the end, and now they were being treated exactly as they treated me, without inclusion, without warning, without comfort. When the last box was loaded, when the truck closed its doors, when the buyer walked through the entryway for the first time and nodded in approval, I felt no satisfaction, no gloating, no joy, only confirmation that the only justice left was the one you delivered for yourself when no one else believed you had the right. My son stood in the driveway, asking what they were supposed to do now, asking if I would really leave them homeless, asking if I was serious, and I did not answer, because the truth had been spoken long before the house was sold, when they decided that the person who paid for their future had no place in it. They thought I would never stand up for myself. They thought I was too old, too passive, too desperate. They thought betrayal would go unpunished. They were wrong. After the final signature was inked and the buyer's funds confirmed and counted by both legal teams on site, I handed over the envelope containing the original deed to the agent, turned away from the home I had spent the last 18 months financing, planning, and dreaming about, and walked past my son and Mira without speaking, because there was nothing left to explain to people who had already rehearsed their betrayal down to the minute. The realtor gave them a formal notice of transfer, instructing them to vacate the premises immediately and remove all personal property before sundown or risk having it disposed of by the new owner. And when Mira began raising her voice at the movers, trying to argue about logistics, the agent calmly reminded her that she had no claim and no legal authority to demand anything inside or outside the property. They stood there, stunned and helpless, watching the movers reload every item they had spent weeks planning to install, watching the crew ignore their protests because authorization now rested entirely with the buyer, who had already requested that every square meter of the home be cleared before bringing in new furniture the next morning. I stayed on site until the truck left with their possessions, stood quietly while Myra's tone shifted from entitled to desperate, then to tearful, and finally to silent rage, while my son looked more exhausted than I'd ever seen him, probably realizing that aligning with Mira had not only cost him his home but also the only person who ever put him first for his entire life. They did not apologize, because apologies would have required acknowledging that what they had done was intentional, strategic, and malicious, and even in their shock, they still acted like the situation was unfair to them, still believed I had overreacted, still imagined there might be a path to reconciliation once the tension passed. They expected me to feel guilt, but I felt closure. They expected me to leave a door open, but I bolted it shut. They expected the consequences to be temporary, but I was done making excuses for people who had spent an entire year stripping me of dignity under the excuse of generational difference. Once the truck disappeared down the road, and the buyer's moving coordinator arrived to begin walkthrough scheduling, I handed over my remaining keys, shook hands with the agent, and walked back to the temporary apartment I had arranged after consulting with my lawyer, because unlike them, I had prepared for every possible outcome without assuming someone else would rescue me. I reviewed the transfer confirmation, counted the 24 million yen in my new account, noted the 1 million yen difference from my original investment as the cost of the lesson, and then immediately made a down payment on a new condominium in a well-managed complex close to transit, medical care, and everything I needed for the next phase of my life, one that did not include a single person who had benefited from my suffering. 3 weeks later, I moved into my new place, signed the final documents in a conference room with no one but my lawyer and a representative from Company B. And when the building manager handed me the keys, I did not tell anyone where I was going or give my son or Mira my new address, because no part of my future required explanation or approval from people who had tried to erase me. I decorated the new space with furniture I chose on my own, using money that was rightfully mine, and every item inside reflected a decision I made for no one but myself, without compromise, without outside influence, and without fear of someone else claiming they deserved more because they were younger, louder, or legally connected by blood. I did not answer the first phone call from my son, nor the second, nor the third, and when a letter arrived with shaky handwriting asking to meet and talk things over, I returned it unopened with a message from my attorney stating that any future communication must go through legal channels, because I was no longer interested in emotional appeals that came only after consequences were delivered. I learned that they had been staying at Myra's parents' apartment in the meantime, that the space was too small, that tensions were high, that Myra's parents were less than thrilled about having 2 extra adults taking up space in a home they were not prepared to share long-term, and that disagreements had already started erupting over finances, chores, and daily routines. Neighbors from my old neighborhood reached out to say they had seen Mira arguing outside during the evening, that my son looked noticeably thinner and quieter, that he was working overtime to try to find a new place they could afford without support, and that no one had visited the new house since the buyer moved in with his family. I did not take satisfaction in their discomfort, but I also did not feel pity, because pity requires a belief that suffering is undeserved, and everything they were experiencing was the natural result of arrogance meeting reality and entitlement meeting a wall they never expected me to build. They believed that if they controlled the narrative long enough, they could gaslight me into submission. They believed that if they smiled while betraying me, it would hurt less. They believed that if they twisted the meaning of family, they could justify theft. They believed that if I said nothing, I had no power. They were wrong about every one of those things. I checked the property registration 2 weeks later and confirmed that the title had been officially transferred, that my name was no longer associated with the address, and that the new owners had filed for full renovation permits to change several features Mira had insisted on, because even strangers could see that the space had been designed for vanity, not for home. I forwarded every final receipt to my accountant, closed the project folder labeled House with D&M, and archived all related emails, then scheduled a formal letter to be sent through my lawyer outlining that I would be issuing no future financial support to either of them under any circumstance. They did not lose a house, they lost access. They did not lose support, they lost trust. They did not lose comfort, they lost a future they could have built with me but instead chose to steal from me. I gave them everything they asked for. They gave me silence, exclusion, and erasure. And in return, I gave them the one thing they never expected: consequences. 2 months after the house sale was finalized and my new condo secured, my son attempted contact again by leaving a voicemail that began with an apology and ended with a request to talk about how things got out of hand. But I deleted it without response because I had already spent over a year watching them carefully plan every step of their betrayal while pretending it was love, and now that the outcome no longer served them, they were trying to rewrite the past as a misunderstanding instead of a calculated extraction of my life savings. They framed it as a family matter gone wrong, but what they had executed was not miscommunication or generational friction. It was financial exploitation cloaked in politeness, deception masked as inclusion, and betrayal disguised as logistical planning. And I was not interested in being reinvited into a narrative I had been cut out of the moment the last wire transfer cleared. I received a certified letter weeks later from my son explaining that they were struggling to find a suitable rental, that Mira had been unable to return to work due to stress, that her parents were pressuring them to move out, and that he hoped I could reconsider the outcome, since I was now secure and comfortable. But I forwarded the letter to my attorney without opening it and instructed him to respond formally with a final statement. All matters relating to financial assistance, housing, or cohabitation were closed permanently. They tried to paint my actions as revenge, but nothing about what I did was fueled by spite or emotion. It was a response proportionate to the scale of betrayal I had endured after being used for capital, erased from decisions, and then discarded at the moment my resources were exhausted. They had every opportunity to be honest before the house was completed. They had every opportunity to treat me like family during construction. They had every opportunity to include me in decisions about space, budget, and long-term living. They had every opportunity to tell the truth before the truck arrived. But they chose to wait until I had nothing left, until I had already vacated my apartment, transferred my savings, signed every invoice, and stood alone with no safety net, because they believed they could rewrite the ending after the contract was sealed. They tried to break me after I had built the very structure they stood inside. They mistook my quiet support for blind obedience. They mistook my willingness to sacrifice for permission to exploit. They mistook my love for them as proof I would never protect myself. After my lawyer responded with a closure notice, they stopped reaching out for several weeks. But then I received a message from Myra's sister, who claimed that I had torn apart a family and suggested that a real mother would never put her son in such a situation. But what no one in that household seemed willing to admit was that it was not I who tore the family apart. It was the people who had built an entire future using my money while planning to exclude me from it. They believed I owed them unconditional forgiveness simply because they shared my last name. But I no longer subscribed to a version of family that demanded silence, financial sacrifice, and emotional suppression in exchange for proximity to people who only valued me as long as I was funding their comfort. I was not obligated to reward their betrayal with continued access. I was not required to explain why I refused to be used again. I was not responsible for their poor planning, selfish assumptions, or entitled expectations. I was not going to offer shelter to people who had planned to evict me from my own home. I did not respond to Myra's sister, nor did I respond to the message from Myra's mother that arrived 2 days later asking if we could all move past this like grown adults, because no grown adult should require financial deception to secure housing. Their network of enablers attempted to pressure me through guilt, through shame, through distorted narratives of what good parents do. But I had lived long enough to know that good parents provide, but they are not required to sacrifice dignity for the comfort of those who trade love for leverage. They stopped calling after my lawyer sent a final cease and desist notice regarding unsolicited contact, and I have not heard from them since, although I received a quiet message from a former neighbor who said they had seen Mira outside her parents' building crying in the parking lot after another argument about space and noise complaints. I have not spoken to my son in over 6 months, and I have no intention of resuming contact, because the final time we spoke, he stood beside a woman who told me to leave the home I built and asked if I could just treat the money as a gift. He stood there and said nothing. He stood there and let it happen. He stood there and agreed. He will have to live with that silence for the rest of his life, because I will not carry it anymore. I have nothing left to give to people who take. I have no space left for people who erase. I have no words left for people who silence me. And I owe no forgiveness to people who only remember me when they are afraid. Now, when I wake up each morning without waiting for someone else's needs to define my schedule or my usefulness, I realize that everything I feared about solitude was nothing compared to the humiliation of being surrounded by people who only saw me as a funding source and not as someone with thoughts, boundaries, and a lifetime of sacrifices behind every decision I ever made for them. I move through each day without needing to ask for space, approval, or permission, because the moment I sold that house and reclaimed what they had tried to bury under contracts and politeness, I also reclaimed every part of myself that I had handed over without realizing how long I had been trained to stay small for the comfort of others. I used the funds from the sale not to replace what was lost, but to reinforce what I still have, investing in systems that protect my future legally and emotionally, documenting every step I took, not because I want revenge, but because I want clarity in a world where too many elders are pressured to call exploitation help and silence respect. I made peace with the fact that my son chose his comfort over my dignity, and that his version of family demanded my erasure in exchange for his pride. And I no longer need to analyze why, because no justification can undo the moment he stood beside someone who treated me like a liability and called it a lifestyle choice. I no longer believe that reconciliation means returning to old roles or reopening doors that were shut for good reason, because I have seen firsthand how easily people will ask for peace once the damage has been done, not to repair it, but to avoid accountability for what they did when they thought I would never resist. I learned that forgiveness is not required when the harm was strategic. I learned that love is not a blank check for abuse. I learned that loyalty is not owed to people who cash it in as leverage. I learned that walking away is not a failure. It is the final form of protection. I attend local community events not because I need socialization, but because I want to be in spaces where no one is trying to manipulate my silence, and I share my story in private workshops with elder support groups, not for validation, but because I wish someone had told me earlier that it was okay to say no, even to your own child. I no longer refer to him in conversations as my son, because that title was revoked the moment he decided I was an obstacle rather than a parent, and I no longer tell the story from a place of pain, but from a place of precision, because letting people know what happened ensures that others will recognize the red flags I ignored for far too long. When people ask what the hardest part was, I don't say the betrayal, I say the realization that I had been complicit in my own erasure by valuing peace over boundaries, inclusion over respect, and hope over truth for longer than I should have. When people ask if I would do it differently, I say I would still help my family, but only once, and only with contracts, and only with clarity, because support without limits is not generosity, it is an invitation for erasure. I now have full control over my future healthcare, housing, and financial assets, and I have left clear instructions that no contact from either of them will be entertained under any circumstance, regardless of future hardship, illness, or regret, because I am not a revolving door of forgiveness for people who only knock when they have nowhere else to go. I do not wait for apologies. I do not wait for understanding. I do not wait for closure. I already gave myself all three. And if you are reading this because something inside you is unraveling, because you feel taken for granted, or silenced, or manipulated under the label of family, I want you to understand that nothing you give will ever be enough for people who see your value only in what you provide. You are allowed to draw a line even if it's late. You are allowed to say no even if you once said yes. You are allowed to reclaim everything they told you was lost the moment you started asking questions. You are not too old to begin again. You are not too kind to protect yourself. You are not too connected to let go. You do not owe anyone access to the parts of you they tried to own. You do not need to explain why you walked away from people who made your existence conditional. You only need to decide that your story will not end in silence. I sold the house they tried to steal. I kept the money they believed I would never protect. I wrote a future without them in it. And I am finally free.